It was 2 months ago that our congregation marked the observance of Tisha B'Av, a commemoration of the destruction of the first and second temples, with a sermon that Friday night about a new form of mourning with which we might mark the day. If it feels no longer appropriate to sit in sackcloth and ashes for Jerusalem, which is now a thriving city, it is perhaps more important than ever to note the ways in which that city, and in reality the whole nation, exists in bifurcation. It is a wholly divided country, pun intended. But this division, the one currently tearing at the very fabric of the country today, it is not the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It is far closer, in fact, to the rabbinic warning issued after the destruction of the first and second temples, which the rabbis tell us were taken from us, not because of some outsider's army, but because of sinat chinam, meaningless infighting. My heart breaks for Jerusalem today and Israel, barely 75 years old. Our family faces a crisis today in Israel, which has been simmering under the surface for as long as the Jewish eye has turned to the east. The sages ask us to consider the holy city of Jerusalem and all that it represents on this first day of the new year, a day of self-reflection and communal reflection. On Rosh Hashanah, we consider with fresh eyes the story of the Akedah and Abraham's journey specifically to Mount Moriah to sacrifice his son to a demanding God. Israeli poets have for decades understood walking in Abraham's shoes as generation after generation of Israeli children are sacrificed on the altar of war to that same demanding God who met with Abraham and Isaac on the mountain where Jerusalem would be built. Today, these simmering tensions have bubbled over, and those who understand our history and those who feel invested in the dream of a democratic and Jewish Israel must take note and stand and be counted. Our support of Israel's founding principles has never been more vital. Many of you have already perhaps streamed the live conversation that we held just last week with Ita Prince Gibson, past editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Report and the Israel editor for Moment magazine. It will be posted again today on our Facebook pages. Her perspective from the ongoing protests in Jerusalem was both comforting and deeply disturbing. I felt comforted that tens of thousands of Israelis continue to reject the twin bedfellows of Netanyahu's corruption and the radical right's oppressive agenda. During any other time in Israel's history, the dismantling of the judicial branch of government and the courts, the rolling back of equal rights for liberal Jews, for women, for the LGBTQ community, it would be unthinkable. And what Ita confirmed for us, however, was just how dire the situation feels on the ground. These pieces of legislation are already moving through the Knesset, Israel's parliament. And if they are not stopped by the Supreme Court, backed by Israel's figurehead President Herzog, let me just say that our parents and our grandparents could never have imagined the miracle of Israel's very existence under such a real internal threat. And as we begin our Aseret Yemei Teshuvah, the 10 days of repentance, our teshuvah must include theirs as well. Earlier this month, 3 of Israel's top liberal minds, Mati Friedman, Yossi Klein Halevi, and Daniel Gordis, penned an open letter. It read, "To our brothers and sisters in the diaspora, we are writing you from Jerusalem during this time of introspection and self-reckoning to urge you to join the extraordinary Israeli protest movement that is fighting to save the vision that created this country 75 years ago. This political crisis is not just one more Israeli debate over policy, but a struggle over the fundamental identity of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. A year ago, they write, Israel was a regional powerhouse. Within a year, we could be on the road to becoming another failed Middle Eastern state. One could argue that Israel has been in a single continuous existential crisis since the state was first recognized by the United Nations and then immediately set upon by 7 Arab armies in 1948. And many rabbis preach regularly in congregations around the globe of the importance of our continued support of Israel and the history of our oppression, growing anti-Semitism, and our annihilation that has made the stakes for Israel's success so very high. And those sermons continue, as do the many reasons why we should be proud of and supportive of the state of Israel. But we know that many, especially younger American Jews, raise serious doubts about Israel and could not support an Israel divorced from its founding principles of equality, democracy, and pluralism. That is not being hyperbolic. The state of Israel, the eternal homeland for the Jewish people, it was founded on the ideals of equality, democracy, and pluralism. They are ideals explicitly spelled out in Israel's Declaration of Independence. And as you leave today, you walk past the display in our gathering space that has an image of the appropriate paragraphs from Israel's Declaration of Independence highlighted. These are Jewish principles. They are vital to the soul of the country, just as vital as Torah law, and vital for the realization of Herzl's dream, for Israel to reach the potential that we know has always been embedded in its neshama, in its soul: equality, democracy, and pluralism. Israel has wrestled with these concepts just as surely as its namesake Jacob wrestled with that angel. Israel stands for equality. The Declaration of Independence promises to, quote, ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, and sex, and to extend our hand to all neighboring states in an offer of peace. There are many of us who believed that we were on a precipice of a new era of cooperation with the Palestinian Authority as far back as the Oslo Accords in 1993, again in 2000 at the Camp David Summit, and as a new modern Israeli center arose as recently as 2012, 2013. The wheels of history move slowly, but all of that felt like progress. We cannot afford to lose traction for the sake of the Palestinians and Israel's own sake. Israel stands for democracy. For those not following the story, the current Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, is failing his country for two interconnected and very different reasons. First, after having served as Prime Minister for 15 years, Netanyahu is facing charges of bribery and fraud, a list of other corrupt practices. I pray that we are still shocked when an elected official faces criminal charges and jail time, especially when that individual seems willing to trample on laws, customs, and etiquette to get themselves out of trouble. Netanyahu has proven that he will dismantle Israel's democracy for his benefit. It is as simple as that. He and his ultra-right-wing cronies are attempting to sever the checks and balances which exist now between the Knesset and the Supreme Court in Israel. And that means that the charges against Netanyahu, should the courts no longer have authority to challenge him, will be easily overcome or even dismissed. In Israel, there are only the two branches, since the legislative and executive branches are one and the same. And with this safeguard gone, the ruling coalition will operate with absolutely no oversight. And while Israel's ethnic democracy might look very different than America's melting pot democracy, salad bowl democracy, if you will, these are the very foundations of the system: respect for and a balance of powers, both of which this current coalition threatens. Israel does also, in fact, stand for pluralism. Pluralism means that Israel must acknowledge that not every citizen is Jewish, and all citizens' rights must be protected. It also means that not every Jewish citizen is going to define Judaism the same way, and that this country is going to be defined, has always been defined, through a global collective conversation about what makes a Jew. And as is the case with the real progress made in moving toward peace with our Palestinian neighbors, not to mention our other Arab neighbors, Jordan, Syria, not Syria. I wish I could say Syria. Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia. We have also taken incredible steps towards defining liberal Judaism in Israel and for Israel. It may be surprising to learn that more and more of Israeli society has begun identifying with progressive Judaism, Reform and conservative Judaism in Israel. A study in 2018 showed that we have reached a critical tipping point. For the very first time, the numbers of liberal affiliated Jews and the numbers of Orthodox affiliated Jews are equal. A majority of Israeli society have been to a Reform synagogue for a service, life cycle event, and a majority of Israelis now know what Reform is. They consider it a valid expression of Judaism. It is hard to overstate what a sea change this represents. The vast majority of Israelis have always self-identified as secular. But as secular Jews, most of these Israelis attend high holiday services. They observe Shabbat with their families. Many of them keep some level of kashrut as well. For years, our movement cried out, "If you would but see us as your brothers and sisters, Reform Judaism has much to offer you." And they have begun to do so. Netanyahu is failing Israel in this arena as well. The current ruling coalition he has put in place represents those most loyal to his efforts to undermine democracy. Netanyahu has always made deals with the various and very small, ultra-Orthodox, right-wing, radical elements in Israel's society. This is the reason why religious sites are controlled by the ultra-Orthodox, including the Western Wall. This is why these same groups do not pay taxes, why they enjoy substantial government subsidies, and why they do not send their own children to serve in Israel's military. We have largely bought into a false premise that Israel is awash with religious Jews, having 8 to 10 kids, multiplying. But in truth, only 12% identify themselves that way. Another 12% now see themselves as Reform or conservative Jews. Rabbi Gilad Kariv, a graduate of Hebrew Union College in Jerusalem's Israel program, is now the first Reform member of the Knesset. And of the more than 50 Reform congregations in Israel, more than a dozen of them now receive official financial support from the government, just as their Orthodox colleagues do. And as you can imagine, this is all very threatening to the status quo. The minority radical right is watching their stranglehold over definitions of Jewish sacredness and Jewish identity slip away. Last year, over 300 non-Orthodox conversions happened in Reform congregations in Israel. And over 1,800 non-Orthodox weddings were performed by Reform rabbis. We are taking major steps forward in establishing thriving liberal Jewish communities in Israel under the banner Yesh Yoter Miderech Echad Lihyot Yehudi. There is more than one way to be a Jew. Benjamin Netanyahu came along at just the right time, looking for just the right partners to get himself acquitted of corruption charges, while his old buddies from coalitions past needed a prime minister who would double down on their monopoly on religious sites and religious issues. And coming up on their legislative agenda are new laws which would abolish equal protections for the LGBTQ plus community in Israel, dismantle Israel's free press, undo controls on settlement activity in the West Bank, and relegate the role of women in society to one based on Orthodox teachings. The question I know will come: what right do we have to interfere? The answer is that there is simply no one else who will. No one else will raise this warning, sound the alarm, voice the concern, if we sit idly by and do nothing now. This is our birthright, just as surely as free 10-day trips to the same homeland will continue to be. Rabbi David Hartman, founder of the famed Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, used to teach that Israel is too important to leave to the Israelis. Yossi Klein Halevi teaches that Israel is the project of the Jewish people. And even Danny Gordis, American-born Danny Gordis, who once urged American Jews to stay out of Israeli politics since, quote, we don't live there. He now argues that, quote, if you think Israel is making a huge mistake and is sliding in the direction of becoming non-democratic, you owe it to the security of the Jewish people more than the security of the Jewish state to say what you believe. The good news is that there is plenty of fight left. Tens of thousands of Israelis continue to protest. Ita, our guest last week, shared that most of her friends and family now plan Saturday nights around going to protests. Childcare is offered by several organizations so that parents can attend. More than 20%, 1 in 5 Israelis have participated. Meanwhile, over 1,100 Israeli Air Force pilots wrote that they would refuse to fly for a dictator. And many reserve pilots have already refused to continue their volunteer service. A letter was given to Netanyahu, signed by dozens of former top security officials, including former heads of the Israeli Defense Forces, the Mossad, Shin Bet, and the Israeli police, demanding that he end his agenda. Israel's top business forum has opposed the government, and many units of the current Israeli military have threatened to stand down. Israel stands for equality and democracy and pluralism, and that promise of the founding fathers has yet to be realized. An Israeli constitution, a Bill of Rights, which would have enshrined these democratic principles into law, has been left unwritten and unsigned. And in its place, Israel has what they call basic law, which is, as it turns out, easy to change with a simple majority in the Knesset. The very issues that have kept some of us distant from the Jewish homeland, they are finally front and center. After decades of debate and controversy and existential threat from within and without, today the hope of our grandparents is presented to us as a simple question. Are we prepared to work as our ancestors did for a vision of Israel as a safe haven for all her inhabitants, a shining example of liberty and human rights? Do we believe it is possible for the Jewish values that we teach and that we preach to manifest in this land, about which David Ben-Gurion once said, "Here, in order to be a realist, you must believe in miracles"? Or are we prepared to abdicate Judaism to those in black coats and fur hats who would tell us that we are not Jewish enough, to those whose own commitment to Jewish values extends only to the shtetl in Eastern Europe in the 1800s and no further, to those who reject the vision of Herzl and Jabotinsky and Golda Meir and Ben-Gurion and Begin and Rabin, and who would create an isolationist, racist, and theocratic authoritarian regime? This is the question. This past spring, our Reform Rabbinic Conference shared a Shabbat at Bet Daniel Synagogue in Tel Aviv, one of the largest Reform shuls in Israel. The Rabbi Meir Azari shared these words. He said, "We fight for a Judaism not based solely on halakha, but enriched by the voices of the prophets, who remind us that corruption, both political and spiritual, must be fought at all costs. Upon my return, I wrote these words to you in our Kulanu newsletter. In the coming months, we will appreciate that our Jewish identity, our safety and security, our culture and religious lives as Jews in America have all been inextricably linked to Israel's fate and destiny, for better and for worse. We share spiritual bonds as well as physical ones, the theoretical bonds of democracy and the financial bonds of brothers in arms responsible for one another. We will find ourselves unable to persist here should those bonds be permanently severed. Our synagogue is forming a new Israel-focused committee, designing itself to discuss these issues, to educate our community, and to explore opportunities to support the right organizations on the ground and to plan upcoming visits. I welcome any and all of you who wish to join. And I would ask us all to start today by matching your High Holy Day Appeal annual donation to IHC with funds that support the Association of Reform Zionists of America, ARTZA, at artza.org, arza.org. Our good friend and colleague, Rabbi Josh Weinberg, carries on the tremendous work of his father as executive director of this arm of the Reform movement. In his last email, Rabbi Weinberg commemorated the second yahrzeit of Rabbi Dick Hirsch, founding rabbi of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism in Washington, D.C. Rabbi Hirsch worked closely with the NAACP, with Dr. King, and even provided space when they needed a headquarters for the civil rights movement. That was Jewish space. And in his book on Israel, Rabbi Hirsch reminded us of the rabbinic adage, Kol Yisrael Arevim Zeh Lazeh. All of the Jewish people, all of Israel, are responsible for one another. To be a Jew, he wrote, is to be wedded to the collectivity we call the Jewish people. Judaism has given the world fundamental ideological foundations. The Exodus from Egypt gave the world the concept of human freedom. Sinai, ethical law, biblical tradition, historical purpose leading to the messianic hope for peace and brotherhood. The world instinctively recognizes that if this people, the perennial victim of mankind's evil impulses, can return to its land, restore its sovereignty, revive its language and culture, absorb Jews from 70 divergent cultures, and we pray establish enduring peace with its neighbors, then is there not hope for all humankind? It's why the state of Israel is central, and it's why progressive Judaism is vital. Because we, progressive Jews, as he calls us, stand firmly on fertile ground, synthesizing faith and people and Torah and land, history and modernity. I honor Rabbi Hirsch for the firm foundation that he has laid for us. I am proud to stand next to Rabbi Weinberg and so many others fighting with every breath for this vision for Israel and for the Jewish people. I continue to be inspired by the dedication and commitment that comes from our congregation, past, present, and future, through our unshaken belief in that continued miracle. Israel, Jerusalem of gold.